Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 53 of the Immigration Lawyers Podcast. This is going to be a special interview episode with attorney Peter Afrasiabi. Peter is a top intellectual property attorney with a passion for immigration law, and he's written his second book on the topic. The book is entitled Burning Bridges, America's 20-Year-Old Crusade to Deport Labor Leader Harry Bridges. It's an excellent book that's available right now on Amazon and on Apple. Peter's also going to have a book signing in San Francisco at Copperfield Books on the 27th, as well as in Orange County. To get more information, please email him at burningbridgesbook@gmail.com. Without further ado, let's get started. So, Peter, thanks for joining us again. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
My pleasure to be here.
So it's a special episode we're having of this interview. It's about a new book you have called Burning Bridges, America's 20-Year Crusade to Deport Labor Leader Harry Bridges. I read the book, and it's fascinating, and I just want to talk about details of what happened in the case and frankly, how you put a book together, because I'm sure a lot of attorneys are always interested in writing a book, but it seems daunting. With the amount of research you've done in here, I assume your explanation might make it more daunting for that. But not all books have to be this researched and this, frankly, well-written. But why don't you start? How did you get interested in this topic?
You bet. I have many years in my Ninth Circuit pro bono appellate filings had cited the Bridges v. Wixon case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court held that meticulous care is required in all deportation proceedings because one could lose their life or liberty. And it's this high-level language that I regularly cited. And I had frankly always wondered, given the powerful concurrence in the case written by Justice Murphy, who wrote that the case against Bridges was a testament to man's intolerance to man, I'd always wondered in the back of my mind, what's the real backstory? And why was the government so relentlessly pursuing, a guy with the last name Bridges, right, an Anglo-Saxon name, which isn't sort of the likely name in an immigration proceeding. And so after I did my last book, Show Trials, I started looking around a little bit to understand more of the backstory, and I couldn't really find much. I found some materials written by his labor union when they were raising defense funds for him in the 30s and 40s, and it sounded sort of over the top and frankly incredible. It was sort of talking about what went wrong in the case and how the biased judge, perjuring witnesses, framing and all this stuff. And I thought, yeah, that's probably puffery from the union. I need to find the original materials. And eventually, with great difficulty, I found the original trial examiner's decision. It was the dean of the Harvard Law School. And I read it and was floored, because here was the dean of the Harvard Law School writing about stuff that was frankly far worse than even the union understood, in terms of the break of due process and judicial abdication and, assassination attempts, perjuring witnesses, an absolute framing of Harry Bridges. And even then I thought, well, I don't know. I mean, he's citing to he's got all these quotes and he's citing to some of these source materials, but maybe he got it wrong, or who knows what the deeper story is. But then I was hooked. And so I went into the National Archives up in San Bruno and got archive materials from various libraries all over the country, and sort of spent many years collecting up the materials and tracking them all down and then studying them. And, as I read the original trial transcripts, it was just magical and incredible, because it was sort of like a legal archaeology, almost, reading these paper thin, ancient documents and reading and realizing that it was in many respects even worse as you started going through all the trial transcripts than even the examiner had been able to sort of come to grips with, given the volume of material. And, then I was hooked and did FBI FOIA requests, and then started putting together the full story, which was spanned 20 years and 4 separate trials. And so then it became an effort to gather the materials from all the different trials, read these 4 trial transcripts and distill it. And it was just an exciting process. But yes, it was a multi-year process that that had to work in tandem with running my law firm and litigating my cases. But absolutely well worth it. And it became sort of a story as it unfolded. It became very clear that you had these amazing strands of overzealous prosecutors who were just out to win. You had these incredible private defense lawyers who were effectively pro bono, defending civil rights cases and fighting these ideological deportation battles. You had the executive wanting to maintain complete dominance over the immigration arena. And then you had this battle between the federal courts and the executive that kept playing itself out in the saga. And so all those strands came together and just made for, to me at least, what was a fantastically fascinating and interesting story. And in the middle of it all, in all of the different trials, there was such courtroom drama and such sort of amazing examples of, amazing cross-examination and laying traps and perjuring witnesses being caught. And I mean, it sort of just was a fantastic story for us as lawyers in terms of seeing the different approaches to cross-examining witnesses and illuminating the truth in stories, and then arguing in the Supreme Court as his cases went up. And so sort of just loved it, was hooked on it, and spent the last few years working on it.
Could you talk a little bit about the story very briefly of like who Harry Bridges was and what got the government and large parts of the population so riled up that they would persecute him like this?
You bet. So he was a longshoreman who came from Australia, brought with him very progressive labor beliefs, which at the time were far more progressive than existed in America. And he was just a working longshoreman dealing with very, very difficult living conditions and working conditions in the Embarcadero in San Francisco. The Great Depression takes root, and there's no real union. There's kind of a sham union up there that was a sellout to the ship owners and the Employers Association and didn't give workers any real rights. And then in the Great Depression, obviously things are even tougher. And, the New Deal starts passing some laws that allow for more collective bargaining and unions to be formed and get together. But really up there's this sort of corruption in the existing union doing, back-end deals with the ship owners. And so Harry Bridges just started publicly speaking on the docks as just a worker, saying this is wrong, this isn't right, we got to have a real union, we got to be willing to fight for our rights, we got to have a democratic union and not have corruption and have a transparent union, no racism. And as he spoke, his voice took root, and the men on the docks literally just started listening to him. And so he formed, in effect, a faction within the existing union structure. Even though he didn't have any political power, he just had this sort of voice that men listened to and followed, and he was, one of those people who just struck a chord. And more men listened to him to the point that he effectively had enough people on the front lines following him that he could force his way in to demand change. And so things came to a head when the ship owners wouldn't do a proper deal with the folks on the union front, and Harry Bridges said, no, we have to have a strike. And he demanded a strike, and enough men voted and followed him that he was able to sort of break the union structure and start what was the Great Strike of 1934 on the West Coast that really shut down shipping, across the whole West Coast for a fair amount of time. And it was in the middle of that the police were brutal, and they killed several of the longshoremen. Hundreds were wounded with shots to the back as they were fleeing. And this sort of combustible situation then just sort of started exploding. And Harry Bridges was sort of in the middle of it, and then demanded a general strike, and other unions from other sectors of the economy actually joined, and it was the first general strike on the West Coast here. And for a couple of days, San Francisco was literally shut down. I mean, no cars were running, there was only a few restaurants open, gas stations were closed. I mean, the whole place just shut down. And out of that, eventually, federal mediators came in, and the ship owners were broken and were forced to deal with a real union, and Bridges then was able to cement a fair deal with, fair hourly wage, proper working hours, no bribery and kickbacks anymore. And so he built out of that a democratic union that was transparent, where he would never earn more than the political leaders of this new union would never earn more than the highest paid longshoremen. And it was out of that then he comes to power and has a union that's really made substantial gains. And as this happened, cries went up from capital, so to speak, that he was really a member of the Communist Party and he should be deported in order to silence his voice. And so federal investigations started, and local police investigations, and the American Legion was heavily involved. And everyone sort of from all of those quarters went to work to find proof that he was a member of the Communist Party, because under the law at the time, if you were a member of the Communist Party, you could be deported. And there was a whole rash of communist deportation trials going on, starting in the 30s and into the 40s and 50s. And, he was swept up in that as they started, trying to build a case to that he was a member of the Communist Party. And that then led to the very first trial, which began a 20-year odyssey of 4 serial trials as the government repeatedly tried to prove and really frame him as a member of the Communist Party, because ultimately he was not a member of the Communist Party.
That's interesting. They still have a holdover of this immigration applications and naturalization, where they ask about Communist Party membership. At this point, unless someone's specifically calling for some sort of armed aggression against the state or overthrowing the government, it's pretty ludicrous to include this kind of ideological test before getting some sort of immigration benefit. But it's something that's just stayed with us for all this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable, and he then was one of the many people, and his just became one of the larger cases symptomatic of this hysteria about communism, and ultimately illuminates, the danger of this executive control over the immigration system, where, they were able to literally put on professional perjuring witnesses to claim that they had seen him at Communist Party events. And they would put on a whole roster of witnesses who would then, testify that the Communist Party sought the overthrow of the American government in order to deport him. And so he's caught up in the middle of this. And what's particularly interesting, really, for many of your listeners, is that he won on his first trial. That was the dean of the Harvard Law School, found that the government never proved that he was a member of the Communist Party, and in fact, the government had put on perjuring witnesses who, literally repeatedly lied to frame him. They tried to put on doctored evidence. There's this whole fantastic story about this alleged Communist Party membership card that he allegedly had in his mother's maiden name that was proven to be a fake as part of this sort of campaign to smear him. There were local police officials from Seattle and Portland working with the American Legion who were framing him, and all of these people testified and were shredded on cross-examination and proven to be perjuring liars. And so he won the first case. But really, he thought, great, I've won, I've proven I'm not a member, I can now start my real American life. And really all that happened is that set off a bomb in Washington, D.C., and part of what the government did then was, pass the Smith Act as a compromise, because the House was so incensed that Harry Bridges got off, they passed an illegal bill of attainder, and it passed by sort of 440 to 30 votes, basically, whereby they just ordered his immediate deportation with no further hearing. And the compromise then to deal with the fact that it was a grossly illegal bill of attainder was to pass the Smith Act of 1940 so that they could retarget Harry Bridges, and they just changed the substantive scope of the laws on this ideological test, got around double jeopardy, and it was all designed to retarget Harry Bridges. And at the very same time, and this is particularly relevant today, those in Congress demanded that immigration be moved from the Department of Labor to the Department of Justice, and so they could the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover in on it in terms of the investigation. And that was part of the compromise. And so that was what caused immigration and then the then INS to be moved from labor to justice. And that was a massive, significant shift, obviously, because immigration fundamentally is a labor issue, but now it was being moved to the Department of Justice, where it'd be looked at through the crime and justice prism. And that precedent was all circling around this Harry Bridges. And then you of course, as we all know, you fast forward 75 years, you have 9/11, and immigration gets moved yet again from the already harsh crime and justice prism, from the DOJ, to now the new DHS, where, people are charged with national security and terrorism and all that. It's an even harsher lens, right? And so this bouncing immigration department into ever more restrictive executive agencies all started with Harry Bridges, and that's part of the legacy of his story.
Yeah, there's so many interesting little points that come up in the book. For example, this was at the time when the first female labor secretary came into power, and with the mindset of people at the time, she was in charge essentially of the first trial of setting it up, and they worked to undermine her, even though she was reasonable. And there's speeches she gives and talks that came out, where she listened to the story and knew the facts and said, this isn't real. This guy's not some communist trying to overthrow the government. But the hardliners just weren't having it. I'm sure there's a lot of misogyny and all that comes into play with that. The other aspect is, everything in this revolves around San Francisco, but you had Northeastern police forces, INS, and congressmen and groups targeting him, which was a different jurisdiction, different authority. It's amazing how they could just be on their own, come here. And they did a lot of it illegally, using funds that weren't intended for police forces to come into California for example, I think the Portland Police Department, to come here and do this investigation. It's extraordinary how unorthodox the process was, and that itself wasn't a red flag. If authorities in San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles can't find anything bad, why would need the different states to come in and do that? So it's amazing the miscarriage of justice that was happening, abuse of power, and all of that. What stood out to you the most of this process? Obviously, the guy's rights were just trampled upon, and it kind of did set the tone of how these things, INS, will work. But what were the big takeaways from this injustice?
There's a few massive takeaways. One is the absolute danger of allowing, unlimited executive control of the immigration system and the court proceedings to the exclusion of the federal judiciary, and the danger of ceding ever amounts of power to the executive without allowing real judicial branch oversight. And so his case and Harry Bridges ultimately survived by the skin of his teeth only because he routinely was able to get into the federal courts to challenge what was happening to him in these executive immigration courts. And at first, the lower federal courts in the cases, the district courts in the Ninth Circuit, really prostrated themselves to the executive, and they just sort of bought into these doctrines of deference to the executive on the matters of immigration and whatnot, and allowed these, really shocking abuses, to go unremedied. And it was only because he was so lucky that he got to the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court, by one vote, concluded that what happened was, was really outrageous in short, and was a shambolic, example of the government's, attempts to provide someone with a fair hearing and a proper process. And so the Supreme Court was willing to stand up to the executive and say no, even though it was a time of great hysteria and fear, where there was incredible, pressure, political pressure from all quarters to allow this, this ferreting out of communists to go forward in order to save America because of the fear-laden environment. And so one of the big lessons is obviously the role of the federal courts and the need to have federal courts that are absolutely willing and able to stand up to the executive, but also for the body politic to not constantly strip the federal courts of jurisdiction over immigration matters, which obviously has been happening in the last quarter century for all of us, because it's the only way you can ensure ultimately the due process occurs. The other big takeaway I thought that was really remarkable was the role of the private civil defense lawyers, who themselves suffered massive public scorn and intimidation in terms of their zealous defense of Harry Bridges, because he was alleged to be a communist, and the media painted him as a member of the Communist Party, and public animosity against communists was obviously very, very high. And so the lawyers that defended alleged communists like Harry Bridges themselves suffered massive public scorn. One of the remarkable documents I got from the FBI in my FOIA requests was a document that Hoover and Connolly, the assistant director of the FBI, had issued, saying that in the event of any kind of a national emergency, Harry Bridges' lawyers had to be immediately detained, right? No basis for arrest, no due process, just detain them and hold them immediately. And these were American citizen lawyers who were simply defending someone who was alleged to be a communist. And it was all because the lawyers were believed to be communists or members of the Communist Party, which, of course, for citizens was not illegal at the time. But it didn't really matter. They got lumped into this. And then as you see in a couple of the cases, the lawyers then who defended Harry Bridges were ultimately, one of them was jailed for several months back east and was unable to defend Harry Bridges because he'd been jailed in a case for defending an alleged communist for, engaging in too zealous advocacy. And so a new lawyer had to step in, and this was sort of a fantastic lawyer who's sort of an Alec Baldwin lookalike almost, from San Francisco, a real trial slugger of a lawyer, who got into heated battles with the federal judge up in San Francisco, and the judge had really sort of fell to the winds of the time. And ultimately, this judge, on the third day of trial, on a multi-month trial, declared the lawyer, just from the bench, declared the lawyer to be in contempt and jailed him for 6 months. And so this lawyer ultimately spent 6 months in federal prison up in freezing Puget Sound simply for his, zealous defense of Harry Bridges and his demand to defend the person and provide a fair trial. And so you think today about sort of the different environment we're in, but the strand of the story that's so important is sort of the role of private lawyers who are willing to take very unpopular causes to demand that due process reign supreme and to protect the Constitution. And if we don't have lawyers doing that, it's very, very easy for due process to fall in the hands of these executive courts and especially in the immigration realm. And that's sort of one of the great takeaways I thought that was particularly moving to see.
I agree. Due process is just the core of what the American system is about. Without it, we would just turn to a third world country. Even with high, economic gains and money, and all that. Frankly, there's countries in the Middle East that are financially rich, but without due process, it just becomes a totalitarian state with oligarchs. And that's beyond lawyers. If the population really understood what due process means, I think the term kind of is vague for them. They don't understand the depths of it. And frankly, a lot of attorneys don't either. They just look at the legal game as a job that they do. But the philosophical and underpinnings of the nation of having due process is so key. And it's constantly stripped away. Even from the beginning of the Republic, as soon as they signed the Constitution, they got away with due process through various alien sedition acts and all that kind of stuff. So it's a constant pull. In light of the recent travel bans, we did see federal courts in Washington State and D.C. and in the East Coast accepting challenges and undermining the executive policy. Now, whether their basis of what they did that for, the reasoning, to me, it's not clear whether it was really 100% correct. But at the same time, having the ability to challenge executive authority and then moving it up to the Supreme Court is so key. Thankfully, that was possible in the travel ban case, and it was to a certain extent possible in the Harry Bridges trial. But as you wrote in your other book, this isn't really the case for immigration proceedings. It's been blocked having any sort of higher level review of cases. It's limited to some immigration court that's under the executive. So, the understanding of the population of due process, regardless of who it is and where they're from, is so key to keeping the country as it is. And I'm glad you wrote this book for people to know about that. Now, on the book, it says soon to be a major motion picture. How's that going along, and what's that about?
You bet. So some Australian filmmakers, learned about my book before it had come out and reached out to me and have optioned it, and they're making it into a movie. So that process is underway by these Australian filmmakers who, were moved by the story of Harry Bridges, and they didn't, as Australians, they didn't know about this guy who, left their country with his, progressive labor beliefs and demanded that his labor beliefs be accepted into American democracy and paid a massively heavy price to fold those sort of Australian-bred beliefs into America. And so sort of this immigration transmission mechanism that's so valuable in terms of how America builds and grows upon its immigrant base and whatnot was part of what they found so moving and exciting to learn about this sort of Australian who had come to America and done all this, and really rendering him probably the most important Australian immigrant to America ever in terms of how he affected us politically and socially. And so that was particularly moving to them, as was, and you alluded to it earlier, the story of Harry Bridges and Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member, because she was charged with deporting him. She did these investigations and concluded from the INS and the police in San Francisco where he lived that there's just simply no evidence he's a communist. He's just not a Communist Party member. There's nothing we can do about deporting him. But she had so much scorn heaped upon her, and because she was not willing to deport him because there was no evidence that he was a communist, she ultimately was called before the Judiciary Committee and subjected to impeachment proceedings. And, here you have, and in the book, there's this photograph that I just thought was so amazing where you've got Frances Perkins, this fiery, strong woman defending herself, surrounded by a gaggle of men on the Judiciary Committee because she's the only woman, being forced to defend herself in impeachment proceedings, and she ultimately prevailed in them. But the cost was that she was then forced to trigger this case against him and prosecute him, even though she didn't really believe he was a member of the Communist Party. And so you've got this, she's being persecuted, and she's being forced to persecute him, and he's being persecuted, and he greatly respected her, and she respected him. But they're both caught up in this insane situation where they become adversaries. And that whole story and dance between them is particularly interesting and fascinating to the filmmakers, and that's part of what they want to explore in the movie. So hopefully I can come back on soon with names in terms of, who will be the actors and who will be directing and whatnot. And that's all underway as they develop it.
Yeah, we'll love it. It'll be very interesting. All I have to say about the book is it's for immigration lawyers. They need to read this because it gives more depth understanding to what we do and why we're where we're at and the whole process. And the more we know about the history, because there's a line I wrote here. It's a quote by Cicero you include in the beginning of the book. It says, if you don't, and I'm paraphrasing, but if you don't know your history, you're nothing more than a child, essentially, because you don't have any history of what happened before you. Even if you're physically an adult, you're still mentally a child. And that's so key for us when we're arguing immigration cases, to have an in-depth understanding of the history of what got us here. And that could help in advocacy and understanding and tactics and strategy to win your case. So having knowledge of books like yours, especially with the citations, this is a scholarly book. This is a book that's going to be used by graduate students in the future. So it's a primary source to have. That's awesome. But moving on, practically speaking, and thank you for talking about this book. How do you get involved with writing a book and getting a publisher? Where does that start, and to get where you want to go? I've written a book, and I'm editing myself. I was thinking about self-publishing, but it's so hard to go over and have the time. Could you speak a little bit about that, of how your process of writing a book, because you've written multiple books now, and just getting that to publishing? That's probably a topic that we could have multiple hours to talk about. But very briefly, how does that go? How does that happen?
You bet. That's a separate topic that really is worth multiple hours. But in short, it starts with, finding something that was particularly interesting and compelling, doing the research, reading those source materials, and then realizing, okay, there's something here. And I spent really a lot of time before I did the writing trying to understand the history of what happened and contextualizing it. And then and this is where I think for lawyers, in some sense, it's easier than for many other people to write a book, because so much of what we do as lawyers is we take these massive, complex records of cases that we're dealing with, and we figure out there's a massive amount of information, and we have to distill it down to its core, figure out what are the the root witnesses or issues or facts in order to tell a compelling story to a judge or a jury for jury or bench trials. And in some sense, it was a very, very similar process. There's 4 trials here. Each of them were multi-month trials with dozens and dozens and dozens of witnesses, and you can't condense all of that down into a 250-page book by recounting everything that happened. So it was a question of bringing order to the chaos, and that's sort of a uniquely sort of lawyer-driven skill set. It's not only lawyers obviously can do it, but lawyers are particularly well trained to bring order to sort of chaos like that. And so that actually was a very, very fun part of the process in terms of going through and figuring out, what is, as you distill the first trial, what were, who were the 10 key witnesses, and what were the pivot points and the fulcrum of the whole thing, and doing that repetitively, and then doing the research, and then the writing process itself. The research and writing just took several years because we are busy as lawyers running our cases, but I found that by breaking it up into very discrete parts and saying, okay, I'm going to spend the next couple months just focusing on these are the 6 trial testimonies that really mattered, and I need to just summarize them into their core and then, write it up and keep going. And I found just breaking it down into compartments like that actually made it very, very manageable. And it was just a question of methodically, and routinely sitting down and writing. And then being, of course, in the mood to write, which itself, sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. But, many, many times it would keep me up almost all night because it was just so exciting and invigorating going through these ancient transcripts, and distilling the information.
With regards to publishing, do you, when you have the idea, do you go to a publisher and tell them and start working on it? Or did you start the book and then once you had a draft, take it to a publisher to work on?
Yeah, I went the latter, in part because I think it's too complicated on the front end. I didn't really understand where the story would go and whether it was really right. And then it was so exciting to do it that it was more a question of, let's get this thing written and at least get the first few chapters written. So I started reaching out after the first few chapters in the introduction, because once I had the introduction really set in terms of what the overarching story was, and then the first few chapters written, you've got your writing style, you understand now the kind of the vein that you're in on this thing, then you have a very clear vision of the rest of the book, and you can summarize it in great detail, and then you can start talking to people and whatnot, trying to figure out where to go.
Just to wrap things up, going back to the book and some historical perspective, this book took place, this situation took place in the middle of the Great Depression. Wages were bad and people were just having a bad time. And this Bloody Thursday strike that shut down the West Coast was amazing. That one person could literally shut down business all across the West Coast. But it's not that far off from these kind of situations happening again. If the economy goes bad, already have a situation where in the U.S., although there's the unemployment rate is really low, excuse me, the amount of income people are making is not necessarily rising, especially for the lower 80% of the population. So these kind of pressures still exist. The Uber and Lyft driving is not really making people money. So if some sort of economic situation that happens that's disruptive, it's going to have effect on the people, and this stuff's going to rise again. The growth of pressure from labor groups, and then from that, increased immigration issues and fights against immigrants and all the pain and backlash that's created during these situations. That's just already happened under the current administration when you see all the policies and plans that they have in place. So it's a fascinating book, Peter. Thank you so much for writing that and coming to speak about it.
My pleasure. Thank you, and thank your listeners.